The grand hall of the Galactic Council gleamed with polished stone and hovering light orbs, designed to impress those who walked its vast chambers. Today, it held representatives from over 50 starfaring species, each seated in their respective enclosures, tall insectoid Hfy clicking their mandibles in amusement, the crystalline torsi humming in amusement, and the ever-smug Xyrelians reclining lazily in their floating chairs. At the center of the amphitheater stood Captain Elias Voss, humanity's representative, flanked by his delegation. He kept his expression neutral, hands clasped behind his back, feet planted firmly. He was no stranger to these meetings, but today's session was worse than usual. High Chancellor Zaltor, an elder of the amphibious Uroth, stood above the assembly, his translucent skin glistening under the artificial light. His lips curled into something that might have been a smile, if it wasn't so condescending. "Ambassador Voss," Zaltor said smoothly, his voice amplified across the hall. "The Council has reached a decision regarding your recent complaints." Voss knew what was coming. He had spent the last 3 years arguing for fair trade rights, equal military agreements, and an end to the Council's heavy-handed interference in human colonies. Every time, humanity was dismissed like an unruly child at an adult's table. "We have reviewed your requests for independent trade and the lifting of technological restrictions," Zaltor continued, his webbed fingers pressing together. "After much deliberation, we have determined that humanity's technological exports will remain heavily regulated. The reasoning is, of course, simple. Your species is impulsive, reckless. The rapid expansion of your influence concerns the Council." A murmur of agreement rippled through the chamber. Voss inhaled slowly. "And yet," Zaltor went on, "we do recognize humanity's unique contributions. Thus, while your technology will remain restricted, you will continue to provide advancements in medicine, shipbuilding, and computational sciences, under Council oversight, of course." Voss narrowed his eyes. "So, we're good enough to serve, but not to lead?" His voice carried through the chamber, measured but sharp. Zaltor let out a chuckle, echoed by the other diplomats. "Ambassador, surely you understand. We act only in the best interest of galactic stability. A species so young must be guided." Another ripple of laughter. Some of the representatives didn't even bother hiding their grins. Voss felt his jaw tighten. Every time humanity pushed forward, they were swatted back. Every innovation, every discovery, claimed by the Council, used freely, while Earth scientists were shackled with red tape. And yet, humanity was always the one being called reckless. He glanced at his delegation, scientists, economists, military strategists. Each wore the same expression of barely concealed anger. They had worked tirelessly to secure humanity's place among the stars. And here they were, being laughed at like a circus act. Voss exhaled, slow and steady. "Tell me, Chancellor," he said, his voice even, "are there any species in this Council who have not, at some point, waged war?" Zaltor blinked. The room quieted. The Hfy had once devoured half their neighboring species before learning diplomacy. The Torsi had glassed planets in their ancient civil wars. The Xyrelians had built their empire on conquest. Voss let the silence stretch before continuing. "Humanity's history is no more violent than yours. The difference is, you had millennia to rewrite your sins. We've only had a few centuries." Zaltor's smile didn't waver. An eloquent speech, but irrelevant. "The decision stands." Voss stared at him. He had expected this, but hearing it spoken with such smug finality made his blood boil. Across the room, the Vren ambassador, a feline-like being with golden fur, leaned forward. "Perhaps we should revisit this in another 100 years. Maybe then, humanity will have learned patience." More chuckles. Voss said nothing. He glanced at the datapad in his hand. The economic reports, the technological contributions, the strategic defenses, every chart showed the same truth. Humanity had given far more than it had received. Enough. He pressed a button on his console, sending a prepared signal to Earth's diplomatic channels. Then, he straightened. "The Terran Republic acknowledges the Council's decision," he said coolly. "And we will respond accordingly." Zaltor gave a satisfied nod. "Excellent. I trust this means you will continue cooperation under our guidance." Voss's lips curled into a small smile, but there was no warmth in it. "Something like that." He turned, walking toward the exit without another word. His delegation followed, their faces unreadable. The doors slid shut behind them, cutting off the murmurs of alien laughter. They wouldn't be laughing for long. The diplomatic shuttle carrying Elias Voss and his delegation cut through the void, leaving the Galactic Council station behind. The silence inside the cabin was thick, but not from peace, only barely contained fury. No one spoke. They didn't need to. The decision had been made long before that final meeting. Voss sat in his chair, fingers steepled, eyes locked on the swirling stars outside. Across from him, Ambassador Renata Cho, his chief trade negotiator, tapped impatiently against the armrest. "They think it's a joke," she muttered. Voss exhaled through his nose. "They'll find out otherwise soon enough." Nathan Kessler, head of economic policy, leaned forward. "We're sure about this?" Total withdrawal. His voice wasn't uncertain, just measuring the weight of what they were about to do. Voss turned his gaze to him. "They won't respect us. They won't treat us as equals. And they've given no reason to believe that will ever change." Cho crossed her arms. "We've been playing by their rules for too long. It's time to show them what happens when we stop." Voss nodded once, then tapped the interface on his wrist. A secure transmission connected them to Earth's diplomatic command center. The screen in front of them flickered, revealing Secretary General Elaine Foster. She looked calm, composed, but her sharp eyes betrayed the tension beneath. "Captain," she greeted, then scanned the room. "I take it things went as expected." "They didn't just reject us," Voss said. "They laughed." Foster's lips pressed into a thin line. "Then we move forward," she said. "All assets are being retracted as we speak. Trade agreements, research collaborations, military assistance, it all ends today." Kessler folded his hands. "That's going to send shockwaves. We make up nearly a quarter of the Council's economic output." Cho smirked. "They've never thought about that before. Why start now?" Foster nodded. "We'll see how long their confidence lasts. Effective immediately, all Terran corporations are ceasing off-world exports. Every human scientist under Council employment is returning home. Military cooperation is dissolved." She let that sink in before continuing. "Additionally, we're recalling all Terran-built AI systems from Council infrastructure." That caught Kessler off guard. "All of them?" "All of them," Foster confirmed. "That includes their logistical networks, navigational AI, and security grids." A heavy silence fell over the room. "They rely on our AI for interstellar coordination," Kessler muttered. "It would take them decades to rebuild that from scratch." Voss leaned forward. "And they think we're the reckless ones." Foster met his gaze. "It's done. By the time they realize what's happening, the last lines of code will have been pulled." The transmission ended. For a long moment, no one spoke. Then, Cho let out a slow breath. "It's going to be ugly." Voss stood. "Good." 2 weeks later, the cracks begin. The Grand Hall of the Galactic Council was quieter than usual. The smug amusement that had filled the air just weeks ago had dimmed into something more uncertain. High Chancellor Zaltor sat at the head of the chamber, listening to the latest reports. The supply chains from human sectors have collapsed, an Euloxi delegate reported, his gill-like appendages fluttering with agitation. Trade stations that relied on Terran logistical AI are in disarray. We've already had 7 major transport failures, 3 of which resulted in total cargo losses. Zaltor's expression remained unreadable, but his fingers drummed slowly against the armrest. This was expected. Humanity's withdrawal is an inconvenience, but nothing we cannot endure. The Xyrelian representative, a sleek, dark-skinned being with piercing yellow eyes, leaned forward. "An inconvenience? You fail to grasp the scope of the problem. The Yelvan Republic has already entered economic recession due to the loss of Terran exports." Another voice cut in. "And what of the research facilities? Half of our experimental projects were being led by human specialists." Zaltor waved a hand dismissively. "We will replace them." The chamber fell into an uneasy silence. Finally, the Vren ambassador, the only one who had stayed silent until now, leaned forward. His golden eyes were unreadable. "Perhaps," he said slowly, "we underestimated their importance." Zaltor's gaze snapped to him. You would suggest we capitulate? The Vren bared his sharp teeth in a grin. I suggest we stop pretending that humanity's departure was insignificant. A murmur rippled through the hall. 3 weeks later, the realization. Zaltor stood in his private office, reading the latest reports. They weren't just bad, they were catastrophic. The technological infrastructure was degrading at an accelerating pace. The Council had known that humans were pioneers in AI-driven logistics, but they hadn't grasped how deeply integrated those systems had become. Supply lines were bottlenecking. Resource allocation models had reverted to outdated calculations. Trade stations were grinding to a halt. Entire sectors were falling into disarray. And then there were the security failures. Without human oversight, cybersecurity breaches were increasing. Even the Council's most classified networks had become vulnerable overnight. Zaltor clenched his jaw. A soft chime indicated an incoming transmission. He pressed the console, and a familiar face appeared on the screen, the Vren ambassador, his feline features impassive. "They are not coming back," the Vren said without preamble. Zaltor narrowed his eyes. "They will. They cannot survive without the Council's resources." The Vren let out a quiet, rumbling laugh. "That's what you still don't understand." He leaned forward, eyes gleaming. "They don't need us." The screen flickered off. Zaltor stared at the blank display. For the first time, a sliver of doubt crept into his mind. "You said." The Council chambers, once filled with condescending laughter at humanity's expense, now held a very different atmosphere. The usual grandeur, the hovering light orbs, the polished stone reflecting the glow of the massive galactic insignia, felt hollow. Conversations were hushed, and every delegate present carried the weight of the past weeks in their eyes. Zaltor sat at the high podium, shoulders tense, scanning the latest crisis reports. The fractures in the Council's infrastructure had deepened. Supply chains were no longer just inefficient, they were failing outright. The regions most reliant on Terran-built AI were in chaos, with entire trade hubs rendered inoperative. The security lapses had worsened, with several sectors reporting cyber breaches that had leaked sensitive intelligence. He clenched his webbed fingers into a fist. The doors slid open, and a Zirali ambassador strode in briskly. His tall frame, once exuding smug superiority, now carried barely concealed frustration. Without preamble, he slammed a datapad onto the central table. "This," the Zirali growled, "is a disaster." Zaltor didn't look at the pad. He already knew what was on it. "Elaborate." The Zirali's golden eyes flashed. "Planetary unrest is rising in at least 7 systems. The outer colonies are talking about breaking away. Our fleets are stretched thin trying to keep everything under control. And now, the Hfy Syndicate," he spat the name, "has started raiding trade routes unchecked." The room stiffened. The Hfys were opportunistic scavengers, a coalition of pirates and rogue warlords. Normally, they wouldn't dare test the Council's defenses. Zaltor exhaled through his gills. "You're saying we cannot control our own space?" The Zirali's jaw tightened. "I'm saying that without Terran AI coordinating fleet movements, our response times have slowed by 40%. The Hfys know it. They're hitting cargo convoys before we can intercept. Do you understand what that means?" A cold silence settled over the chamber. Finally, the Vren ambassador, who had been quiet through the exchange, spoke. "It means the Council is bleeding." His golden eyes flicked to Zaltor. "And I suspect humanity is watching." Zaltor's grip tightened on the edge of his seat. "Request an emergency audience with the Terran delegation," he ordered. The Zirali's expression darkened. "And what do you expect? That they'll come crawling back out of goodwill?" Zaltor's patience thinned. "No. I expect they will negotiate, because they are not foolish enough to believe isolation benefits them either." The Vren let out a quiet chuckle. "You still don't get it, do you?" Zaltor's eyes narrowed. The Vren leaned forward. "They did not isolate themselves. They left us behind. Terran Prime, the new power." The vast metropolis of Terran Prime shimmered under twin suns, its towering arcology spires gleaming with the light of endless innovation. Unlike the controlled stagnation of the Galactic Council's worlds, this place thrived. Starships moved with the seamless precision of human-designed AI, and entire industries hummed with purpose. Elias Voss stood in the command center of Terran High Command, watching reports scroll across the massive display. Trade with independent systems had surged in the weeks since humanity severed ties with the Council. Dozens of non-aligned species had come forward, eager to secure new partnerships now that humanity was no longer bound by Council regulations. Behind him, Secretary General Elaine Foster read from a data slate. 73 new trade agreements signed, 23 more pending. The Archon Dominion has officially requested direct military cooperation. Voss exhaled. That didn't take long. Foster smirked. They knew it would come to this. The moment we stopped letting the Council dictate terms, the entire balance of power shifted. Nathan Kessler, standing nearby, nodded. They're still too proud to admit it outright, but the Council is floundering. Supply disruptions, economic downturns, security collapses. It's only a matter of time before they make an offer. Voss folded his arms. And when they do... Foster's smirk turned razor-sharp. We name our price. A soft chime interrupted them. Speaking of which, Kessler said, glancing at the screen, we have an incoming request for a diplomatic meeting. From the Galactic Council. Voss exchanged a glance with Foster. No one looked surprised. Put them through. The holo display flickered, revealing High Chancellor Zaltor. The confident, mocking expression he'd worn weeks ago was gone. His posture was rigid, but his eyes betrayed frustration. Ambassador Voss, Zaltor greeted, the words thick with unspoken bitterness. Chancellor, Voss replied smoothly. A long pause. Then Zaltor exhaled. The Council wishes to renegotiate the terms of our partnership. Kessler let out a soft chuckle. Foster tilted her head, faux sympathy in her gaze. Oh. I was under the impression the Council had everything under control. Zaltor's jaw tightened. We acknowledge that adjustments must be made. Voss leaned back. Let me be clear. Humanity will not be returning to the previous arrangement. Zaltor didn't flinch, but the tension in his shoulders deepened. We understand. Voss studied him for a moment. The Council was desperate, but desperation alone wasn't enough. They had spent too long treating humanity as an afterthought. That would end today. You want our help, he said finally. Then here's what's going to happen. The chamber fell silent. Voss's voice was calm, but his words were absolute. Full technological autonomy. No restrictions, no oversight. Human AI systems will remain exclusive to us. Military assets will be deployed on our terms, not yours. Trade will proceed under our authority. He leaned forward slightly. And lastly, humanity will no longer answer to the Council. We will negotiate as equals, or not at all. Zaltor's gills flared, his amphibious features betraying discomfort. That is a steep demand. Voss didn't blink. It's not a demand. It's the new reality. Zaltor's mouth opened as if to argue, but he stopped. He saw it now, clear as the void beyond his station. They had lost control. There was no more humanity asking for recognition. There was only humanity taking its place. The silence stretched for several seconds. Then, finally, Zaltor gave the smallest nod. The Council will deliberate. The transmission cut. Kessler let out a slow breath. They'll agree. They don't have a choice. Foster smirked. I almost feel bad for them. Voss exhaled, turning back to the display of Terran Prime, a city burning brighter than ever. Almost.